Imagine standing at the edge of an ocean that isn't just a body of water, but a living timeline. One that begins in sunlit puddles, where life first flickered into existence, and plunges down into black abysses, where creatures glow, giants drift, and evolution plays by rules no one ever agreed on. This is the story of how life crawled out of chemistry, sprouted eyes for the first time, invented armor when things got bitey, learned to glow in the dark, and built entire kingdoms powered not by sunlight, but by the Earth's own breath. It's a journey filled with ancient monsters, invisible architects, deep-sea philosophers, and animals so strange they seem like late-night doodles that accidentally came alive. And the wildest part, the ocean still hasn't shown us everything. So dive with me, from the first spark in shallow seas to the silent depths where life rewrites itself again and again, and see why the greatest story on Earth is still being written in the dark. When Earth was young, it was not the calm, blue marble we like to imagine. It was a fiery, temperamental world covered in volcanic tantrums, asteroid bruises, and enough heat to make a pizza oven blush. Nothing about it suggested future home of cute turtles and majestic whales. In fact, if you traveled back 4.5 billion years, the closest thing you'd get to a peaceful beach day would be watching molten lava splash over the horizon and thinking, well, at least the parking is easy. But everything was about to change, because this chaotic planet was cooling, slowly but surely, and something remarkable was beginning to happen. Water, actual, honest-to-goodness liquid water, was forming and staying put. As temperatures dropped, the once boiling vapors in the atmosphere condensed and began to fall. Not polite sprinkles, not gentle spring showers. Think every storm ever combined levels of rain that lasted for thousands of years. These weren't the kinds of storms you cancel picnics for. These were the kinds that could create an ocean basin in the time it takes to say, maybe bring a jacket. When the rain finally slowed, the Earth was left with colossal bodies of water swirling across its still-forming crust. Shallow seas shimmering under a sky just starting to calm down. These early oceans were nothing like today's tropical postcards. They were more of a cosmic soup kitchen, full of dissolved minerals, volcanic gases, and all sorts of lively chemical ingredients that future biologists would one day stare at and say, okay, technically it could work. Think of them as the universe's experimental test broth, simmering away while the planet cooled. The seas were warm, not the relaxing spa kind of warm, but somewhere between a heated pool and this must be a safety violation. And yet, in those not quite inviting waters, something extraordinary was brewing. The surface of these young oceans reflected a dim sun that was weaker than the one we know today. Because the planet was still wrapped in thick, stormy clouds and volcanic haze, sunlight fought its way through in pale beams. Enough to glow, but not enough to warm your skin. If skin had existed yet, which it did not. Below that dim sky, currents churned, hydrothermal vents hissed, and chemical reactions crackled like nature's own laboratory experiment. The planet didn't have continents as we know them, just rocky patches and cooling crust that kept reshaping itself like a toddler trying to stack unstable blocks. But the oceans, they were ready. They had the chemistry, the temperature, and the time. There's something poetic about the fact that the biggest twist in Earth's history didn't happen with fanfare or thunderous applause. It happened quietly, invisibly, in a small corner of a vast, murky sea. Somewhere, maybe in a tide pool warmed by the sun, maybe near a volcanic vent, maybe in a shallow lagoon where minerals gathered like enthusiastic party guests. The building blocks of life began to arrange themselves. No one knows exactly how it happened, but you can imagine the scene. Molecules bumping into each other, rearranging, reacting, forming more complex structures little by little. Most combinations failed spectacularly, the chemical equivalent of trying to assemble furniture without instructions. But eventually, something changed. The right ingredients met in the right way at the right moment. And just like that, without a narrator, without a soundtrack, without so much as a raised eyebrow, the first spark of life flickered into existence. Microscopic, delicate, astonishingly simple, yet powerful enough to rewrite the planet's future. If the universe had been watching, this is where it would have leaned back and said, "Now things are about to get interesting." Because that tiny spark didn't stay tiny. It multiplied, adapted, explored its watery world with an enthusiasm that would eventually lead to everything from coral reefs to blue whales to the strange human habit of making documentaries about the deep sea. What makes this moment so enthralling is not just the scientific mystery of how life began, but the sheer cosmic irony of it. The universe is vast, nearly infinite, and among all its swirling stars, its black holes, its galaxies cruising through space like celestial cruise ships, life on Earth began in a warm, shallow puddle. A puddle. It's as though the cosmos said, "Sure, I could start life anywhere, but let's go with something humble, something cozy, something splashy." These first oceans didn't just hold water, they held potential. Every wave that rolled over the young planet carried the ingredients for future ecosystems. Every ripple was a preview of evolution's upcoming show. In these seas, Earth transformed from a violent, molten world into a blue planet with the ability to nurture life, protect it, and eventually let it flourish in ways no early molecule could ever have predicted. As the planet continued to cool and stabilize, these oceans became the cradle that sheltered the earliest biological experiments. They set the stage for everything that would follow: the rise of cells, the branching of species, the endless parade of shapes and strategies that would fill the seas over billions of years. But before all that, before coral gardens and abyssal monsters and shimmering schools of fish, there was this, a quiet, simmering ocean waiting for life to take its first breathless step. And it all began with water, settling onto a planet that finally decided to cool down, a world learning to calm itself, preparing unknowingly for the most important plot twist in its history. A twist that started not with thunder or spectacle, but with a warm puddle that would one day give rise to the entire story of ocean life. If you could dip a hand into Earth's early shallow seas, assuming you owned a time machine and an extremely forgiving immune system, you wouldn't see much at first. No fish darting around, no colourful reefs, not even a stylish strand of seaweed trying to look important. The water would seem empty, almost too calm, like a stage waiting for actors. But give your eyes a moment and imagine shrinking down thousands of times. That's when you'd notice something extraordinary. The ocean wasn't empty at all. It was bustling with tiny, stubborn, hard-working pioneers, early single-celled organisms that had absolutely no idea they were about to rewrite the planet's entire future. These first cells didn't have the intricate features we associate with life today. No nuclei, no mitochondria, no fancy internal compartments. They were closer to tiny bubbles of chemistry wrapped in delicate membranes, quietly running their microscopic routines. And yet, despite their simple construction, they were marvels of biological ingenuity. They drifted in sunlit shallows, multiplying, experimenting with different ways to survive, and adapting to the shifting chemistry around them. If evolution were a marathon, these microbes were the barefoot runners who started the race before anyone thought it was possible. Sunlight played a huge role in their rise. With the ocean's surface shallow and clear enough for light to penetrate, early microbes discovered a trick that would change the game, capturing sunlight to power their lives. Not in the elegant, chlorophyll-driven style plants perfected billions of years later, but in primitive, scrappy photochemical reactions that slowly grew more sophisticated. If you could watch them, you'd see tiny cells floating like dust motes, gathering sunlight in ways that would eventually resemble the very first hints of photosynthesis. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't elegant, and it wasn't fast, but it was revolutionary. Life had figured out how to turn light into energy, and suddenly the shallow ocean was glowing with possibility. These early sun-powered microbes didn't think in terms of global impact. Thinking wasn't exactly their strong suit. but their actions had consequences that rippled through the planet. As they absorbed energy and processed their surroundings, they began shaping the chemistry of the oceans. They altered the balance of gases dissolved in the water, changed acidity levels, and slowly transformed the environment to better suit their needs. It was the biological equivalent of rearranging the furniture in a house no one else had moved into yet. Their influence didn't stop at the water. As microbial life multiplied across the shallows, they formed vast mats on rock surfaces, trapping sediments and creating textured layers like nature's earliest construction projects. These mats weren't pretty, more like slimy biological carpets, but they were powerful. Over time, they built layered structures that would eventually become some of Earth's oldest fossils. Imagine billions of tiny organisms cooperating unintentionally to make geological footprints, all while floating and feeding in warm coastal pools. What made these microbes true planetary pioneers was their relentless curiosity. Though not the kind driven by brains or intention, they simply responded to the environment with the kind of chemical enthusiasm that allowed them to spread, diversify, and experiment with new biochemical pathways. Some specialized in using sunlight. Others preferred chemical reactions powered by minerals leaching from nearby rocks. Some clung to surfaces, forming thin films like invisible paint, while others drifted freely, letting currents push them wherever nutrients might be hiding. In their own tiny way, they were inventing ecological niches long before predators or plants came along to complicate things. One of the most fascinating things about these early cells is how they accidentally set in motion changes that would echo across billions of years. By using sunlight, they created tiny oxygen byproducts that trickled into their surroundings. At first, the oxygen didn't accumulate. It reacted immediately with minerals in the water, disappearing like a message scribbled in sand during high tide. But the more microbes there were, the more oxygen they produced. Eventually, the minerals couldn't absorb it fast enough. Slowly, molecule by molecule, oxygen began to slip into the ocean and the air. The microbes continued going about their business, totally unaware that they were altering the atmosphere of an entire planet. They didn't know that future forms of life would depend on oxygen, or that the sky would eventually take on the color we know today because of their side effects. They were simply living their simple, sunlit lives, feeding, dividing, drifting, while accidentally turning Earth into a world better suited for complex creatures that wouldn't appear for billions of years. And that's the real charm of these early cells. They were tiny, modest, and astonishingly influential, shaping the ocean in ways no creature with a face, fins, or ambition had ever done. They turned shallow waters into lively chemical playgrounds filled with potential. They discovered sunlight as a power source long before solar panels were cool. And they laid down the invisible foundations for the ecosystems that would eventually rise, fall, and fill the ocean with an unimaginable diversity of forms. In a planet still young and storm-scarred, these microbes were the first signs that Earth wasn't just cooling down, it was waking up. And in those quiet, glowing shallows, the earliest hints of life's true potential were just beginning to stir. If Earth had a before and after photo, the great oxygenation event would be the dramatic makeover moment. The point where the planet went from a dim, chemistry-heavy world to one with a crisp, reactive atmosphere that could one day support creatures with beating hearts and complicated opinions. But back when it began, nobody, meaning no microbe, was celebrating. In fact, the biggest transformation in Earth's atmospheric history started because tiny organisms were just doing what they always did, eating, growing, and accidentally releasing a gas that would turn their world upside down. Before oxygen took over, the oceans were like giant chemical cauldrons where life thrived without ever needing to breathe. The earliest cells relied on reactions that didn't involve oxygen at all. To them, oxygen was about as welcome as a smoke alarm at a late-night cooking experiment. Loud, disruptive, and guaranteed to ruin the vibe. The ocean floor was covered in minerals rich in iron. Dissolved gases swirled through the water, and the whole system ran on a delicate balance of reactions that had worked beautifully for millions upon millions of years. It was stable, cozy, and predictable, an anaerobic paradise. But somewhere in the sunlit shallows, certain microbes had discovered the trick of capturing sunlight for energy. And those microbes, just minding their microscopic business, began producing oxygen as a byproduct of their chemical routines. Oxygen didn't start out as a powerful force. It started out more like an unwanted side effect. At first, it reacted instantly with dissolved iron and other minerals, disappearing the moment it was created. But the microbes didn't slow down. They multiplied and kept releasing tiny breaths of oxygen into the water, completely unaware that they were setting the stage for a planetary upheaval. As more oxygen accumulated, the seas began to change in ways ancient microbes could never have predicted. Iron dissolved in the water reacted with oxygen and formed rust, actual rust, which settled to the ocean floor in thick, layered sheets. Imagine the entire planet slowly turning into a giant iron workshop, with minerals oxidizing left and right. Over ages, these layers would harden into the banded iron formations that still decorate ancient rocks today. But back then, the process wasn't geological art, it was chemical chaos. For anaerobic life, the upheaval was immediate and unwelcome. The presence of oxygen was downright toxic to many of these organisms. They had evolved in environments where oxygen simply didn't exist. So when it suddenly started showing up in the water, it was like someone had cracked open every window in a warm, comfortable house during winter and then left the doors swinging wide. Their enzymes misfired, their membranes malfunctioned, and their survival strategies faltered. To them, oxygen wasn't a breath of fresh air. It was a molecular troublemaker that messed with everything they depended on. As oxygen seeped deeper into the oceans, entire communities of anaerobic organisms were forced to retreat, adapt, or perish. Some hid in oxygen-free pockets, muddy sediments, deep-sea crevices, or stagnant layers of water untouched by circulation. Others evolved clever biochemical defenses, turning their once peaceful lives into an ongoing battle against this aggressive new molecule. And some species simply vanished. It was one of Earth's earliest mass die-offs, though not the dramatic asteroid kind, more like the slow, suffocating realization that the neighborhood had changed and the air was no longer safe. Yet while anaerobic organisms were struggling, oxygen was busy unlocking new possibilities. With oxygen accumulating in the ocean and eventually leaking into the atmosphere, the planet's chemistry shifted dramatically. Oxygen is reactive, enthusiastically reactive, and once it started circulating, it partnered with elements that had previously been left to their own quiet routines. New minerals formed, chemical cycles shifted. The atmosphere slowly transitioned from a haze of methane and other gases into something clearer and more dynamic. One of the most astonishing consequences was the formation of the ozone layer. As oxygen moved upward and interacted with sunlight, some of its molecules transformed into ozone, which formed a protective shield high in the sky. This shield blocked harmful ultraviolet radiation, making Earth's surface a far less dangerous place for future life forms. The early microbes never knew it, but their waste product was literally building the atmospheric sunscreen that would make advanced life possible. The Great Oxygenation Event wasn't quick. It unfolded over millions of years, a slow but relentless wave of chemical transformation. But its effects were irreversible. Oxygen eventually became a permanent part of Earth's oceans and atmosphere, paving the way for organisms that could use it as a powerful energy source. In time, life would take advantage of oxygen's explosive efficiency, evolving complex metabolisms that could sustain bigger bodies, faster movements, and entirely new ways of being alive. Though the early anaerobes likely would have filed a formal complaint if they'd had the paperwork, the truth is that oxygen reshaped Earth for the better, at least from the perspective of future plants, animals, and especially humans, who owe their very existence to this planetary shift. But at that moment, long before multicellular creatures appeared, the ocean was simply a world in transition, echoing with the quiet chemical drama of microbes reacting to a changing environment. The Great Oxygenation Event didn't announce itself with erupting volcanoes or dramatic skies. It whispered through the water, molecule by molecule, turning the seas into a vast chemistry experiment that succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of life, one marked by transformation, innovation, and the slow rise of organisms that would eventually inherit a planet, made breathable by the unintentional handiwork of the tiniest architects imaginable. If you could take a time-lapse video of Earth after oxygen began circulating through the oceans, you'd see more than just a changing atmosphere. You'd witness life experimenting with new designs. Not flashy designs, not yet. No swirling fins, or elegant tentacles, or ambitious predators. Instead, the planet was hosting a quiet revolution at the microscopic scale, a slow shift from life's earliest minimalist blueprints into something richer, more intricate, and surprisingly social. The age of simple lone wolf cells wasn't over, but the evolutionary spotlight was beginning to drift toward organisms that were trying something bold: complexity. Complex cells didn't burst onto the scene with dramatic flair. At first, they were just slightly overachieving versions of the simpler cells that had dominated for so long. These new cells, known to science as eukaryotes, though back then they didn't wear name tags, were essentially upgraded models equipped with internal compartments. Instead of letting all their chemical reactions swirl together like a chaotic soup, eukaryotes organized themselves with internal membranes, creating little workspaces inside the cell. Imagine a microscopic office building where each department had its own room, and nobody left their coffee mugs in the hallway. This internal organization didn't just make the cells look tidier, it made them more efficient. With dedicated areas for energy production, DNA storage, and resource processing, complex cells could handle more complicated tasks than their simpler ancestors. They could grow larger, repair themselves more effectively, and manage a wider variety of chemical processes. In the ocean's new oxygen-rich environment, this gave them a massive advantage. They weren't just living, they were thriving. One of the most astonishing things about these complex cells is that they may have begun as partnerships. Some scientists believe that early eukaryotes formed when one simple cell swallowed another but didn't digest it. Instead, the two cells worked out an arrangement, like unexpected roommates, who gradually realize they actually make a great team. The guest cell handled energy production with impressive efficiency, while the host cell provided protection and resources. Over countless generations, this partnership became permanent. The swallowed cell transformed into what we now call mitochondria, the tiny power stations inside every complex cell. Life had stumbled onto one of its favorite creative strategies: cooperation. Not the heartwarming, hold hands and sing kind, but practical, biologically advantageous teamwork. This new approach to living opened paths that evolution had never explored before, paths that led to cells combining efforts, pooling resources, and slowly considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, being part of a group wasn't the worst idea. As complex cells grew more sophisticated, they began experimenting with staying together after division. Simple cells usually split and immediately drifted apart, each going its own way, like two strangers exiting an elevator without making eye contact. But some complex cells stuck around, remaining connected in loose clusters. These early groupings weren't coordinated or graceful. They were more like microscopic crowds, milling around in confusion. But even that was enough to spark something revolutionary. When cells stayed close, they could share nutrients, communicate chemically, and offer each other a bit of protection in a world that was increasingly dynamic and unpredictable. Over time, these loosely connected cells took cooperation to the next level. They began to specialize. One cell handled movement, another focused on absorbing nutrients, another supported the structure of the group. This division of labor was evolution's version of forming a small business. Everyone had a job, and the whole operation ran better because of it. The organisms became more efficient than any single cell could ever be alone. Complexity, once a rare and risky strategy, was becoming a successful way of life. These early multicellular organisms didn't resemble anything modern. They weren't fish or worms or plants. They were soft, gelatinous clusters drifting through the water, held together by the thinnest threads of biological cooperation. But they represented something astonishing, a shift from individual survival to collective functionality. Even though they had no nervous systems or conscious decision-making, their bodies were already demonstrating the principle that would shape future ecosystems. When life cooperates, life can flourish. Of course, cooperation didn't always go smoothly. Some cells undoubtedly tried to take more than their fair share of resources, while others slacked off, letting neighbors handle the hard work. But evolution, patient as always, favored groups where cooperation worked well enough for the organism to survive and reproduce. Those with better teamwork grew larger, experimented with new shapes, and explored new habitats. The ocean began to see organisms with simple tissues, more stable bodies, and the earliest hints of anatomical organization. They lacked bones or shells or anything remotely intimidating, but they were something new. Communities of cells behaving like a single being. This shift laid the foundation for every large form of life that would eventually appear. Without these early pioneers of multicellular living, there would be no forests, no animals, no coral reefs, no humans recording narrated documentaries about creatures of the deep. Everything complex, every muscle, every organ, every structure in a modern body traces its ancestry back to those first clusters of cells that chose cooperation as their survival strategy. In those ancient seas, filled with drifting clusters of simple multicellular forms, Earth was beginning a quiet but profound transformation. It wasn't dramatic or fast, but it was steady, relentless, and full of potential. The age of complexity had begun, carried forward by cells that discovered that sometimes evolution's greatest breakthroughs happen when you stop working alone and start building something together. If someone could have visited Earth's shallow seas roughly 600 million years ago, they'd probably walk away with two strong impressions. First, that life had become surprisingly creative, and second, that fashion was still very much in its early stages. There were no shells, no armored plates, no spiky fins, or complicated tentacles designed for dramatic battles. Instead, the ocean looked like an alien art gallery filled with soft shapes, squishy textures, and organisms that relied more on gentle currents than on mobility or aggression. And yet, even without the flashy gear that later creatures would evolve, these early animals transformed the seas into bustling ecosystems that would set the stage for everything that followed. The first animals didn't burst onto the scene with jaws or claws. They appeared quietly, almost modestly, like invited guests arriving early to a party and arranging the chairs before everyone else shows up. These pioneering animals were simple, but far from insignificant. The earliest among them were sponges, creatures so structurally humble that even modern ones seem content to sit in one place forever, filtering water and looking unbothered by absolutely everything. Ancient sponges weren't flashy, but they were brilliant in their own minimalist way. They built porous bodies that allowed seawater to pass through them continuously, capturing tiny particles of food as it flowed. By doing this at scale, thousands, then millions of them, they began acting like the ocean's first filtration system. They cleared water, redistributed nutrients, and created microhabitats where other organisms could live. Their colonies formed small underwater neighborhoods, stable structures in an environment that was still experimenting with what stability even meant. Around the same time, other soft-bodied organisms joined the scene. These creatures were the distant ancestors of animals like jellyfish, but back then they lacked the stinging flair that modern jellies proudly display. Instead, early jelly-like animals floated or gently pulsed through the water, capturing food particles or small drifting organisms with tentacles that looked more like soft ribbons than tools of predation. They weren't fast, but in a world without predators or quick reflex swimmers, they didn't have to be. Existing was surprisingly low stress. The ocean floor also hosted a strange lineup of soft-bodied creatures that defy easy comparison to anything alive today. Some lay flat like living doormats, others shaped themselves into quilt-like discs, and still others formed frond-like structures that swayed in the currents like tiny underwater ferns. These organisms didn't chase food, they let food come to them. They soaked up nutrients, absorbed dissolved compounds, or captured microscopic particles drifting by. To modern eyes, they would seem passive, even lazy, but in an environment with few competitors, their strategies worked beautifully. These early animals began to shape their surroundings in ways no previous life ever had. Before them, the seafloor had been mostly smooth sediments, with microbial mats forming thin layers here and there. But the arrival of soft-bodied organisms introduced movement, however slight. A jelly-like creature drifting down could leave a delicate swirl in the sediments. A sponge colony could anchor itself and create a small break in the current, altering how sand and nutrients settled. Even slow, creeping motions of pancake-shaped animals produced shallow trails, tiny marks that would one day be immortalized in the fossil record as some of the first animal-made traces on Earth. Their ecological roles expanded as populations grew. Sponges filtered water and recycled nutrients. Jelly-like drifters helped transfer energy from one part of the water column to another. Soft-bodied floor dwellers stabilized sediments and created gentle mounds or depressions that changed how currents interacted with the seafloor. Together, they formed a complex but peaceful ecosystem, a world where survival depended more on finding a good spot and sticking with it than on speed or armor. One of the most fascinating things about these early animals is how they set the stage for more complex interactions. Even though they themselves were simple, their presence created gradients of nutrients, pockets of shade, and textured habitats. These new environmental features offered opportunities for other organisms to evolve alongside them. Where sponges grew in dense clusters, small spaces opened up for bacteria and early protists to hide or feed. Where jelly-like animals drifted, they left nutrient-rich waste that fueled microbial growth. Life was beginning to layer itself, forming the first threads of an interconnected food web. If you could have hovered above one of these shallow ecosystems, watching sunlight shimmer through the water, you'd see a peaceful scene full of movement but no conflict. Soft-bodied organisms swayed, drifted, or simply rested, harvesting energy without disturbing their neighbors. It was a gentle world, almost serene, a moment in Earth's history before nature discovered teeth, speed, or the evolutionary thrill of the chase. And yet, despite the calmness, change was brewing. These early animals were quietly pushing biology toward greater complexity. Their bodies contained multiple cell types working in coordination. Their tissues allowed for structural support, movement, and nutrient transport. Even though they lacked nerves and muscles as we know them, the basic architecture of animal life was taking shape. Evolution was slowly building its toolkit, experimenting with new layouts and new possibilities. In a sense, these first animals were like set designers preparing the ocean's stage. They constructed the earliest reefs, loosely formed, sponge-based structures that offered shelter and altered water flow. They created gradients of light and nutrients that future animals would exploit. They brought movement into the water column and onto the seafloor in ways that had never existed before, without shells, without bones, without anything remotely resembling what we typically associate with animals. They redefined the shallow seas. Eventually, more complex creatures would rise, ones that swam, hunted, hid, and built. But before all that, there was this era of softness, an age of gentle exploration, when the first animals quietly transformed the ocean into a living, breathing community. They weren't glamorous, but they were essential. They took the first steps toward complexity, and the entire history of marine life unfolded from the simple, elegant foundations they left behind. If the earlier chapters of Earth's story felt like a slow, peaceful build-up, cells learning to cooperate, soft-bodied creatures drifting gently through quiet seas, the Cambrian period was the part where evolution slammed its foot on the accelerator and shouted, "Let's get weird." For millions of years, life had been experimenting with multicellularity and basic tissues, but mostly in a calm, low-drama way. Then, around 540 million years ago, something astonishing happened. The oceans erupted with an explosion of new body types, creative survival tactics, and evolutionary experiments so wild they make modern animals look almost conservative. It was as if the planet hosted a biological invention fair and everything, absolutely everything, was allowed. No one knows the exact trigger that set this evolutionary burst into motion. It wasn't a single event, so much as a perfect storm. Increasing oxygen levels, new ecological interactions, genetic innovations, and changes in the environment all converged at once. Whatever the trigger, the result was unmistakable. Animals began evolving with unprecedented speed and variety. The ocean, once a slow-moving world of sponges and soft-bodied wanderers, transformed into a dynamic, crowded, and occasionally dangerous arena. One of the most spectacular innovations to emerge from this time was the development of eyes. Actual eyes. Not the simple light-sensitive patches earlier organisms had used to tell day from night, but sophisticated visual organs that could detect shapes, shadows, and movement. Imagine being one of the old soft-bodied residents of the seafloor and suddenly realizing your neighbor had evolved something that could literally look at you. It must have been unsettling, like showing up at a gathering you thought was casual only to find out everyone else wore formal attire. These early eyes sparked an evolutionary arms race. If one creature could now see, others needed to respond. Some animals began burrowing into sediment to avoid being spotted. Others developed camouflage or started moving more quickly to escape visual predators. Vision gave rise to behaviors that had never existed before: stalking, pursuit, ambush, directional movement. For the first time in history, the ocean wasn't just a place where animals drifted. It became a place where they actively interacted with purpose and awareness. But eyes weren't the only runaway invention. Hard parts, shells, plates, spikes, and scales appeared across multiple lineages. Before this, animals had been soft and squishy, which was perfectly fine in a gentle world. But once predators arrived with mouths and intentions, being squishy was suddenly a disadvantage. Shells offered protection, structure, and a chance to survive the new sharp-toothed neighbors. Some shells formed smooth, conical shapes. Others curled into spirals. Some were sturdy armor plates embedded in the skin, while others grew into entire exoskeletons that animals carried like biological suits of armor. Predators responded in kind. New mouthparts evolved, some resembling claws, others like grasping appendages, and some that looked suspiciously like early versions of jaws. These structures allowed creatures to tear, crush, poke, or simply engulf their prey. The ocean, once quiet, now echoed with the tiny, gentle sounds of animals bumping into each other while attempting to eat one another for the first time in history. Movement became a major theme. Animals developed jointed limbs, flexible bodies, and muscular systems that allowed them to swim, crawl, dig, or scuttle across the seafloor. Trilobites, arthropods with segmented bodies and hard exoskeletons, became some of the Cambrian's most successful residents. They moved gracefully across sediments, using compound eyes to navigate and armored plates to avoid becoming someone else's snack. Their numbers exploded, and their fossils today are so abundant that paleontologists could practically pave roads with them if they didn't value them so much. Other Cambrian creatures were far stranger. Some had long, grasping appendages that looked like biological chopsticks. Some sported feathery gills like delicate fans. Some dragged tails lined with spikes. And then there was Hallucigenia, a creature so baffling that scientists spent decades reconstructing it upside down, confidently mistaking its legs for spikes and its spikes for legs. If evolution was experimenting randomly, Hallucigenia was the prototype that somehow got greenlit anyway. These bizarre forms weren't evolutionary jokes. They were adaptations to new roles in a rapidly diversifying ecosystem. Some organisms filtered water while anchoring themselves to the seafloor. Others became active hunters. Still others scavenged for organic debris left behind by the newly energetic food chains. Nutrients flowed differently, energy transferred faster, and interactions multiplied. Each innovation opened new ecological niches, which in turn encouraged more innovation. It was a feedback loop of creativity. Competition also encouraged cunning strategies. Some animals evolved don't-eat-me tactics like chemical defenses or elaborate spines. Others simply grew larger, hoping size alone would deter hungry neighbors. A few embraced the float away and pretend you're not here strategy, relying on transparency or drifting behavior to avoid attention. The Cambrian oceans were full of creatures testing ideas, most of which worked just long enough to leave a fossil and quietly bow out of Earth's evolutionary story. What made this period so extraordinary wasn't just the abundance of new forms, it was the speed at which they appeared. In geological terms, the Cambrian explosion was a blink, an evolutionary fireworks show that filled the oceans with innovation before anyone had time to process what was happening. Complex food webs arose almost immediately. Predator-prey interactions intensified. Ecosystems matured. The ocean became a highly structured world where survival required creativity. Yet despite the chaos, there was beauty in this explosion of life. It was a moment when evolution discovered the possibilities of eyes, armor, movement, and behavior. It laid the blueprint for nearly every major animal group that exists today: fish, insects, mollusks, worms, and countless others trace some part of their lineage back to the Cambrians' astonishing burst of invention. In the end, the Cambrian explosion wasn't just an innovation festival, it was evolution's announcement that life on Earth was ready for complexity, drama, and a very crowded future. The oceans had transformed from quiet nurseries into bustling arenas, and the world would never be the same again. Once the Cambrians' dazzling burst of innovation filled the oceans with strange new body plans and sensory upgrades, evolution wasted no time shifting into a more dramatic phase, one where curiosity and experimentation gave way to something far more intense: competition. Suddenly, animals weren't just drifting or filtering or minding their gentle business anymore. They were hunting, stalking, dodging, hiding, and outmaneuvering one another like contestants in the world's first survival tournament. The ocean, once a playground, became an arena, and every creature had to decide whether it wanted to be faster, tougher, sneakier, or simply luckier. Predators, now armed with features they hadn't possessed in previous eras, actual weapons, emerged as the ocean's new influences. Some had claw-like appendages perfect for snatching or slicing. Others evolved mouths capable of gripping, tearing, or suctioning prey. And many grew more streamlined, shaped by the growing arms race of swim or be swum over. These predators weren't mindless brutes. They were innovations wrapped in muscle, using sensory cues and movement strategies that had never existed before. For the first time in history, the sea had creatures that could plot a pursuit, gauge distance, then strike with intention rather than chance. One of the stars of this early predatory rise was Anomalocaris, a creature that looked as if evolution had tried to merge a shrimp, a pancake, and a UFO. Its large compound eyes could detect movement at impressive distances, a superpower in its day. It propelled itself through the water with rhythmic undulations of its flexible body, giving it an agility other animals could only envy. But what truly made it a celebrity hunter were its grasping appendages, two spined claws that extended out from its face like biological tongs. When they snapped shut around prey, escape was unlikely. Everything about Anomalocaris said top of the food chain, and it behaved accordingly. On the opposite side of this newfound drama were the prey species, soft-bodied, but often defenseless creatures that suddenly found themselves starring in a horror film they did not audition for. Their best hope for survival was innovation, and evolution delivered. Some grew the earliest versions of armor plates, thin, protective shields that covered their bodies like prehistoric chainmail. Others developed spines or rigid exteriors that discouraged enthusiastic bites. Many took advantage of sediment, burrowing into the sea floor to avoid encounters altogether. Hiding became its own evolutionary strategy, and for many species, it worked surprisingly well. But armor and burrowing weren't enough. Speed became a coveted advantage, and creatures that could scoot or wriggle even slightly faster were given new lease on life. Muscles refined, body shapes streamlined, and locomotion techniques diversified. Some animals adopted a wriggling serpentine motion. Others discovered flapping or paddling movements that allowed bursts of escape. Even a small speed boost could determine whether an organism lived long enough to pass its genes forward. In a way, the ocean became the first fitness club. But instead of judging personal bests, it judged whether you avoided being lunch. Some prey species chose cunning over speed. They evolved shells with deceptive shapes, surfaces that blended into the sea floor, or bodies that mimicked the textures of surrounding environments. Camouflage became one of evolution's most clever inventions, a strategy that didn't demand muscles or armor, but relied on invisibility. The better you blended in, the lower your chance of starring in a predator's dinner plans. In these early seas, deception wasn't a moral failing, it was survival. This predator-prey escalation created one of the earliest feedback loops in evolutionary history. Predators improved their hunting strategies, prey improved their defenses. Better defenses forced predators to refine their tools. Better tools demanded even better defenses. Each improvement on one side triggered responses on the other, like two opposing teams locked in a contest that could never end. And because evolution works gradually but relentlessly, these small changes compounded over millions of years, sculpting creatures into complex, specialized forms. The ocean's energy flow changed as well, with predators consuming prey more efficiently than before. Nutrients cycled faster through the ecosystem. Populations fluctuated, opening and closing ecological niches that species rushed to fill. Diversity expanded, not just in body shapes, but in strategies. Some species specialized in ambush, others in endurance, others in digging, drifting, or darting. The seafloor became marked with trails, burrows, and signs that life was no longer just existing, it was interacting. Competition also shaped behaviors. Some animals began grouping loosely, finding safety in numbers. Others developed more refined sensory abilities, detecting water vibrations or chemical cues that signaled danger. There were no complex brains yet, no thoughts in the way we understand them. But behaviors became coordinated enough to look intentional. Life was practicing for the future, learning the basics of movement patterns that would one day evolve into migrations, hunts, and social structures. Even ecosystems shifted. The seafloor, once covered in microbial mats, saw portions scraped, overturned, or disrupted by animals searching for food or escaping predators. Water columns filled with drifting bodies, large and small, all playing their parts in the whirlwind of evolutionary pressure. What was once a gentle world had transformed into a buzzing, swirling network of interactions that shaped everything from anatomy to energy flow. This new era hammered home one unignorable truth. In these waters, being slow or oblivious was no longer just inconvenient, it was fatal. The ocean had discovered speed, awareness, and conflict, and it had no interest in going back. Life had stepped into a dynamic, ever-shifting realm where competition drove creativity, and creativity drove survival. In the end, the rise of predators and the struggles of their prey didn't just add drama to ancient seas. They propelled evolution forward, encouraging complexity, innovation, and resilience. Every chase, every near escape, every armored plate and sharpened appendage contributed to the astonishing diversity that would eventually fill the oceans. The world beneath the waves had become a stage where life's story gained momentum, and each new adaptation was a reminder that evolution's greatest masterpieces are forged not in safety, but in struggle. As predator-prey battles intensified and the Cambrian seas simmered with innovation, something quietly extraordinary was brewing beneath that chaos. A structural breakthrough so influential that nearly every large animal alive today owes its existence to it. While shells and spines and speedy legs were excellent upgrades, evolution was preparing to unveil a feature that would fundamentally shift the biological blueprint. The backbone, or more precisely at first, a flexible rod called a notochord, nature's prototype for the spine that would later dominate vertebrate anatomy. It was an invention so elegant and versatile that it would become the scaffolding on which fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and yes, even the humans who narrate documentaries would eventually be built. But the earliest vertebrates didn't look grand or intimidating. They were small, slender, and soft-bodied, slipping through the water with a grace far beyond the stiff, armor-clad creatures around them. They were the biological equivalents of sleek prototypes, stripped down, efficient, and ready for future upgrades. Their notochord gave them something revolutionary: flexibility paired with structural support. They could wriggle with controlled movements, generating thrust in smooth waves rather than the floppy thrashing of their invertebrate neighbors. In ocean battles where being slow could cost you your entire existence, this added mobility was a game changer. These early vertebrates weren't flashy. If you could have observed them, you might have mistaken them for slightly fancy worms. They lacked jaws, lacked paired fins, lacked the imposing silhouettes later fish would showcase. But inside their simple bodies were features that evolution had never assembled in this combination before. Alongside the notochord, they developed segmented muscles anchored along its length, enabling efficient sideways motion. They had a dorsal nerve cord, an upgrade over the decentralized nerve nets of earlier animals, letting signals travel quickly through their bodies. And they had primitive sensory capsules near their heads, hinting at a future filled with complex eyes, ears, and brains. One early vertebrate, Hypnotic, is often celebrated as one of the first true fish-like creatures. It was only a few centimeters long, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in innovation. It had a notochord, a streamlined body, and hints of a skull-like structure, making it a pioneer in a world still figuring out what a fish could even be. Hypnotic was not a hunter. It was more likely a nimble grazer of tiny particles or a cautious drifter, but its structure allowed it to move with purpose, dodging predators that would have effortlessly devoured more sluggish creatures. It was built for survival not through force, but through smooth, efficient motion. Another notable early vertebrate, Melocomingia, showcased even more anatomical refinement. It possessed gill pouches for breathing and a body plan that hinted at the complexity to come. Neither species would win a beauty contest unless the judges were overwhelmingly impressed by internal innovation, but they were evolutionary gold. These early fish-like animals were establishing the architectural foundation for nearly every major vertebrate group that would follow. One of the most unexpected improvements to arise around this time was the development of internal cartilage. While many organisms focused on growing shells and armor externally, early vertebrates were strengthening themselves from the inside out. Cartilage, softer and more flexible than bone, allowed early vertebrates to move without the rigid limitations of exoskeletons. This internal framework gave them durability without sacrificing agility, a balance that would become crucial in the evolutionary arms race. Soon, vertebrates began experimenting with features that pushed their mobility even further. Rudimentary fins appeared, simple folds of tissue along the body that provided stability and steering. These early fins were the prototypes for the paired appendages that would eventually evolve into fins, limbs, wings, and everything in between. For now, though, they offered subtle but important advantages. Being able to stay upright, turn smoothly, or stabilize against currents meant these fish-like pioneers could navigate the ocean with a finesse few others possessed. As vertebrates refined their internal systems, they also enhanced their sensory abilities. A more defined head region allowed clusters of sensory organs to collect in one place: primitive ears, smell detectors, and visual structures. This simple organizational shift gave them sharper awareness of their surroundings. They weren't just moving better, they were perceiving better. And in a world where danger could glide toward you with hooked appendages, improved awareness was a lifesaver. All of this innovation placed early vertebrates on a slow but steady trajectory toward dominance. Their efficient swimming allowed them to explore new habitats. Their internal scaffolding permitted larger body sizes in the long run. Their sensory improvements made them competitors worth noticing. They were not yet apex predators, not even close, but they were on the evolutionary path toward becoming some of the ocean's most formidable creatures. For millions of years, vertebrates remained modest, but modesty can be deceiving when the blueprint you're carrying holds the potential for sharks, rays, bony fish, and eventually jawed species that would redefine marine ecosystems. The origin of vertebrates was not a dramatic moment, but a quiet shift, a rethinking of how bodies could be built. Instead of relying on shells or exoskeletons, these early pioneers embraced internal strength and coordinated movement. The rise of early vertebrates set in motion a cascade of evolutionary possibilities. Their backbones would later support powerful muscle attachments, enabling swift bursts of speed. Their internal gill structures would refine gas exchange. Their nerve cords would become highways for complex behaviors. Everything from stalking predators to breaching whales can trace its existence back to these humble, wriggling creatures. In the grand story of ocean life, vertebrates entered quietly, but they would not stay quiet for long. They carried within them the seeds of physical sophistication, sensory complexity, and mobility that would eventually make them the architects of the next major chapters in evolution. Their bodies were simple, but their potential was anything but. Evolution had just upgraded the toolkit, and the ocean, forever changed, was about to feel the ripple effects. As vertebrates continued refining their clever new blueprints, streamlined bodies, internal skeletons, improved muscles, and increasingly sophisticated senses, some of them began peering beyond the familiar, well-lit waters of the shallows. Maybe it started as accidental wanderings. Maybe a few adventurous fish chased prey a little too far downslope. Or perhaps competition near the surface nudged them into exploring less crowded territory. Whatever the reason, life began a slow but momentous descent down the continental slopes, slipping past the comforting glow of sunlight into a world where light itself began to vanish. The first steps into deeper waters were subtle ones. The continental slopes form long, gradual highways descending from the continents into the abyss, and they offered fish a corridor of opportunity, and admittedly, some risk. At first, these fish still relied on sunlight filtering from above, though dimmer and bluer than in their native shallows. But even in that dusky environment, advantages emerged. Fewer predators, less competition, and access to drifting nutrients carried downslope by gentle currents. Venturing deeper came with potential benefits, and evolution has never been one to ignore a potential bargain. As fish explored these descending corridors, their bodies and senses began adapting to the shifting environment. The first and most obvious challenge was light, or rather its disappearance. With every meter of depth, sunlight thinned until eventually there was none at all. Species that depended heavily on vision found themselves in trouble. Eyes built for brightness were nearly useless in the dimness. Shapes blurred, shadows vanished, colors faded into uniform gray. Yet life rarely gives up when conditions shift. Instead, it recruits innovation. The fish that succeeded in deeper waters weren't simply those with bigger eyes. They were the ones whose sensory systems diversified. Some evolved retinas rich in rod cells, capable of detecting faint glimmers or flashes invisible to most shallow water cousins. Others developed incredible sensitivity to movement, with lateral lines tuned to read the water like a living radar system. Even the subtlest pressure wave created by a passing creature became a detectable message. But vision wasn't the only sense being refined. Chemical sensing grew more precise. In the dark, scent trails acted like glowing signposts. A fish might detect the chemical fingerprint of drifting prey hours after it passed, following it like a detective trailing clues through liquid darkness. Some species expanded their ability to sense electric fields, allowing them to feel the heartbeat or muscle twitch of prey hidden just out of sight. In the deepening twilight, electroreception became a kind of sixth sense, one that functioned even when vision surrendered. These adaptations didn't appear overnight. Evolution sculpted them slowly, generation by generation, as fish pushed farther into the gloom. Many early attempts failed. Some species couldn't adjust to the cold, others couldn't locate enough food. Still others lacked the metabolic flexibility needed for a world where meals might be days apart. But for every failure, there were lineages that found ways to thrive. One of the most striking transformations occurred in body shape. As fish crept deeper, many became slimmer or more elongated. A long body conserves energy, fewer muscle groups to power, less drag in sluggish waters, and easier adjustments when needing to pivot toward prey. Others evolved flatter forms to better navigate narrow crevices and rocky ledges scattered across the slopes. Some species took on strangely angular silhouettes, their fins and spines arranged to disrupt their outline, a trick that made them harder for predators to detect in the dimness. Coloration also shifted dramatically. In well-lit waters, stripes and bright colors help with camouflage or signaling, but below the last reach of daylight, color becomes meaningless. Many fish turn dark, midnight blues, velvety blacks, deep maroons, to blend into the backdrop. Others became translucent, their bodies almost glass-like, hiding internal organs behind shimmering invisibility. When you live in perpetual dusk, becoming hard to see is a solid career move. The deeper fish ventured, the more they encountered challenges unfamiliar to their ancestors. Pressure increased relentlessly. Temperatures dropped to levels that would freeze shallow water species solid. Energy savings became essential. Fish slowed their metabolisms, reduced unnecessary movement, and became masters of stillness. Patience became not just a virtue, but a survival strategy. Along the slopes, new feeding opportunities emerged. Small crustaceans drifted downward from the shallows, forming a steady conveyor belt of edible particles. Worms and burrowing organisms inhabited soft sediments. Even the occasional fallen carcass from above offered a rare feast. Fish learned the art of opportunistic feeding, grazing when food was abundant and conserving strength when it wasn't. Some species became ambush predators, lurking motionlessly against rocks until prey wandered close enough for a lightning-fast strike. Others adopted wide-mouth feeding strategies, gulping large amounts of water and filtering out anything remotely edible. The deep slopes became a proving ground for hunting strategies that would later define entire lineages. And gradually, over millions of years, fish reached the point where they no longer needed sunlight at all. They crossed the boundary between twilight and true darkness, becoming full citizens of the deep. Their bodies reflected this shift. Giant eyes in some species, vanished eyes in others, streamlined shapes for constant gliding, or compact bodies built for hovering quietly above the seafloor. This expansion into deeper waters set the foundation for the incredible diversity of deep ocean fish that would evolve later. Anglerfish, gulper eels, bristlemouths, hatchetfish, and countless others. All of them trace their origins to those early pioneers inching down the continental slopes, discovering a world without color, without warmth, and without mercy. The colonization of deeper waters wasn't a dramatic plunge, but a slow, exploratory descent. Life extending curious fingers into darkness, sensing opportunity, and adapting to meet it. In doing so, fish unlocked an entirely new realm on the planet, a realm that would become home to some of the most bizarre, beautiful, and inventive creatures evolution would ever fashion. By the time the first true deep-sea specialists appeared, the message was clear. The ocean didn't end where the sunlight faded. It simply changed the rules, and life, ever adaptable, learned to play by them. Once animal life crossed the threshold into waters where sunlight vanished entirely, the ocean transformed into a stage lit only by biology's own ingenuity. Down here, darkness reigns not as an absence but as a canvas, and evolution, never content with monotony, began painting it with light, soft flashes, drifting sparks, eerie blue glows, sudden bursts like underwater fireworks. Bioluminescence emerged as one of the deep sea's most astonishing inventions. Life didn't just survive in the dark, it illuminated it. At first glance, glowing in a world full of hungry mouths may seem about as sensible as wearing a blinking sign that says, "Dinner here." But deep sea light isn't a thoughtless disco. It's strategy, purpose, communication, camouflage, a chemical performance with evolutionary benefits so clever they feel almost mischievous. To understand how life learnt to glow, imagine early deep-sea microbes and animals experimenting, accidentally at first, with chemical reactions involving luciferin compounds and oxygen. These reactions produced faint light, not through heat like fire, but through efficient biochemical magic. Organisms that could control or direct this glow gained an edge, and evolution seized the opportunity with enthusiasm. Before long, species across the deep adopted light as a tool. Some glowed internally, others grew specialized light organs, or photophores, arranged in constellations across their bodies. One of the earliest and most effective uses of bioluminescence was camouflage, counter-illumination. Many deep-sea fish developed glowing bellies that mimicked the faint light trickling down from above. When predators looked upward, hoping to spot a silhouette against the weak glow, the fish simply blended in. Their light organs flickered and calibrated themselves to match the brightness overhead with astonishing precision. It was like wearing an invisibility cloak made of dim blue shimmer. In a world where being seen was rarely a good thing, becoming a controlled patch of light was a survival masterpiece. But glowing wasn't just about hiding. Some species used bioluminescence as a lure. Enter the anglerfish, one of the deep's most iconic performers. Hanging a glowing lure from a modified fin ray above its mouth, an anglerfish can sit motionless, letting curious prey swim right into its jaws. The lure pulses, flickers, or sways, mimicking the movements of small drifting creatures. It's evolutionary bait and switch at its finest. The prey gets a light show, the anglerfish gets dinner. Other fish turn to light for communication. Certain species flashed patterns to attract mates, each flicker sequence as distinct as a signature. Some coordinated group glows in synchronized patterns that resemble drifting lantern parades. In these depths, where sound travels strangely and sight is limited, a carefully timed sparkle became a reliable way to say, "Here I am, stay away," or "Let's make more of us." For some creatures, bioluminescence became a weapon. Shrimp species developed bioluminescent chemical sprays, essentially underwater flashbang grenades. When threatened, they eject a glowing plume that startles predators and obscures escape. The predator, blinded by the sudden burst of light, often ends up striking empty water, while the shrimp retreats into the dark like a magician slipping behind a curtain. Deep-sea squids added drama to the equation. Some species release glowing clouds instead of ink, creating dazzling luminous smoke screens. Others combine ink and light into glowing ink, which not only blinds attackers, but continues to sparkle as it disperses, drawing attention away from the squid's escape route. If shallow water squid show flare, deep sea squid show full theatrical commitment. Even defense mechanisms took on creative forms. Certain jellyfish, when attacked, explode into a show of pulsing radiance, distracting predators long enough to slip away. Some species glow brighter when injured, like an alarm that signals, "Do not pursue, you've already blown your cover." A few soft-bodied animals use flashes to recruit bigger predators to the scene, weaponizing the arrival of third parties. Imagine getting attacked, screaming, "Help!" in blue light, and having your attacker suddenly realize they've just attracted something far hungrier. Of course, bioluminescence isn't the only deep-sea trick. Fish develop bodies that dramatically shrank energy usage. Some grew elongated jaws, capable of swallowing oversized prey when the opportunity arose. Others evolved hinged skulls to open their mouths like biological bear traps. Certain species develop gelatinous tissues to reduce density and save metabolic energy. A few grew upward-facing eyes capable of detecting even the faintest silhouettes, ghostly shadows of prey swimming far overhead. But light remained the deep's defining adaptation. Some fish arranged photophores in rows along their flanks, making them look like deep-sea aircraft with runway lights. These glowing patterns helped individuals coordinate schooling behavior, even when they couldn't otherwise see each other. Other species used bioluminescence to scan for prey, emitting a faint glow and waiting for it to reflect off nearby organisms. A flashlight technique, but in elegant slow motion. One of the strangest outcomes of evolving with light was the emergence of creatures so decorated with glowing patterns that they resembled neon signs drifting through water. Hatchetfish, with their reflective scales and bioluminescent bellies, flicker like metallic ghosts. Certain dragonfish wear glowing barcodes on their chins to attract very specific prey. And deep-sea bristlemouths, some of the most abundant vertebrates on Earth, glow in subtle waves along their tiny bodies as if breathing light instead of air. What unites all these strategies is creativity born from necessity. In darkness, life does not retreat. It adapts. It invents tools that let it communicate, deceive, hide, hunt, seduce, and defend. Bioluminescence is not just a trick. It is the deep ocean's language, currency, and choreography. A biological torchlight in realms where the sun never arrives. In these waters, glowing isn't flashy, it's survival. And thanks to millions of years of innovation, the deep sea has transformed into a living galaxy where every spark, shimmer, and flash tells a story written not in ink or sound, but in light cast upon eternal darkness. If the deep sea is often portrayed as mysterious, the mid-water zone, the vast, dim stretch between sunlit shallows and the midnight depths, is where mystery decides to get creative. It's a place where sunlight fades into blue twilight, where pressure begins to tighten around anything living, and where food is scarce enough that evolution starts improvising like a sleep-deprived artist. Here, creatures float, drift, and glow in ways that make you question whether nature briefly forgot the rulebook. The animals that rose to dominate this eerie expanse were not armored titans or swift hunters. They were gelatinous, delicate, and sometimes so transparent that you'd swear the ocean was inventing ghosts. One of the most mesmerizing groups to emerge in this zone were the siphonophores. If the word sounds unfamiliar, that's fitting. Siphonophores don't quite fit into the mental categories we like to use for animals. They're not single creatures in the usual sense. They're colonies made up of dozens or even hundreds of specialized units called zooids. Each zooid has a job. Some capture food, some digest it, some float, some reproduce. And together they behave as one beautifully coordinated organism. It's as if evolution tried to build a multicellular creature, but then said, what if every cell had its own apartment and career path? The result is an animal that behaves like a creature, but internally runs more like a microscopic city. Some siphonophores stretch longer than whales, forming living ribbons that drift through the water like illuminated highways. Their tentacles dangle far below the main body, lined with stinging cells that deliver paralyzing shock to anything unfortunate enough to brush past. Yet for all their power, siphonophores are fragile, so delicate that a hard tap from a curious fin would tear them apart. They thrive not through toughness but through elegance, drifting strategically in currents and relying on exquisite coordination. In the mid-water zone, gentleness is not weakness, it is a survival strategy. Sharing the twilight, translucent predators glide like apparitions. Many comb jellies, or ctenophores, appear as drifting droplets of glass, their bodies refracting the faint available light in shimmering rainbows. Unlike jellyfish, they use rows of tiny cilia, little paddles that beat in perfect synchrony, to propel themselves. These cilia refract light like tiny prisms, making the animals glow in pastel hues even though they produce no light of their own. Watching a comb jelly move is like watching a living chandelier drifting through a cathedral of blue. Despite their delicate appearance, ctenophores are effective hunters. Some launch sticky tentacles that grab unsuspecting prey. Others open their gelatinous bodies like nets. And they do it all without nervous systems remotely like ours. Their simplicity hides a mastery of hydrodynamics and strategy, honed by millions of years in an environment where energy needs to be spent carefully. Every motion is slow, intentional, almost meditative. In the mid-water zone, rushing is a luxury no one can afford. Then come the drifters, gelatinous forms that seem more sculptural than biological. Some are shaped like bells, moving with gentle pulses that push them through still water. Others look like delicate umbrellas, bowls, or ribbons that were left in a gentle current to flutter for eternity. Many mid-water jellies glow with bioluminescence, flashing or shimmering when disturbed. The darkness around them becomes a stage, and their bodies are the lights, blinking softly as if telling forgotten stories of ancient oceans. These glows are more than decoration. They are tools for survival. Some animals flash brightly to startle predators, creating underwater jump scares that would make a horror director proud. Others release glowing particles that drift away like a decoy, confusing anything hungry enough to chase after the sparkles. Still others, especially mid-water comb jellies, use their light to lure prey, offering a shimmering beacon that curious creatures approach at their own risk. In the mid-water zone, light becomes a language, a lure, a shield, and sometimes an accidental rave. Food scarcity shaped every body plan in this world. With few nutrients drifting from above and limited life rising from below, creatures had to become efficient. Gelatinous bodies were perfect for this. They require little energy to build, they're almost neutrally buoyant, and they blend into the dim surroundings. Transparency became the ocean's version of an invisibility cloak. If you're made of water, shaped like water, and look like water, then predators have to work much harder to notice you. It was camouflage turned into an art form. Some mid-water creatures evolved strategies that stretch our understanding of biology. Certain predators hang motionless, waiting for shadows to pass overhead. Others drift upside down because evolution never said they had to choose a correct orientation. A few have enormous mouths compared to their bodies, allowing them to engulf prey larger than themselves. A technique that suggests nature briefly entertained absurdity and decided, yes, this should work. What makes this zone so extraordinary is that its residents embody pure survival creativity. Without solid ground, strong currents, or abundant prey, animals here had no choice but to evolve outside the usual templates. So they became whisper-light, ghostly, luminous, and bizarre. They fragmented the idea of what an animal should be and built themselves again from the most flexible materials the ocean had to offer. In the end, the midwater creatures became icons of evolutionary improvisation. They proved that complexity doesn't always require bones or speed or brute force. Sometimes it emerges from delicacy, cooperation, transparency, and a willingness to try ideas that seem impossible. The midwater zone may look peaceful, but beneath that quiet blue twilight is a kingdom of strangeness, where life rises like drifting glow, where predators look like sculptures, and where evolution, at least for a moment, seems to have worked under the soft light of a creative midnight lamp. When cephalopods first entered Earth's oceans, they didn't tiptoe politely into evolutionary history. They blasted in like underwater rocket enthusiasts who discovered that mobility, flexibility, and a suspiciously clever brain could open countless doors. Long before squids inked their way across the deep, and ages before octopuses became the reigning escape artists of the modern sea, their ancient ancestors were carving out an entirely new way of being an animal. They were some of the first creatures to combine mobility, predatory tactics, and complex sensory abilities. In a world still full of slow grazers and early swimmers, cephalopods were the ocean's first true overachievers. Their story begins in the shallows, in a time when the ocean was bursting with new body designs and evolutionary experiments. Among these early creatures were the ancestors of cephalopods, experimenting with long, tapered shells shaped like cones or coils. These shells served as buoyancy aids, letting the animals rise or sink with small adjustments to the fluid inside. It was an elegant system, part submarine ballast tank, part architectural showpiece, but the shell was only the opening act. The real star of the story was the animal hiding inside, working with soft tissues and flexible appendages that hinted at the brilliance that future evolution would unleash. The earliest cephalopods used their shells both as protection and as strategy. By controlling their buoyancy, they could float above the sea floor, scanning for opportunities or threats. Compared to the animals around them, they had a freedom of movement that felt almost futuristic. Where many early marine creatures relied on creeping or drifting, these ancient cephalopods could position themselves with purpose. They weren't fast by modern squid standards, but they were directed, intentional, and surprisingly graceful. But the real turning point came when cephalopods began experimenting with jet propulsion. It wasn't glamorous, more like a gentle puff than a torpedo, but it was revolutionary. By drawing water into their bodies and pushing it out through a muscular funnel, they could create bursts of movement. Suddenly, the ocean had animals that could adjust their speed voluntarily, making split-second decisions about which direction to take. Compared to their neighbors, who often relied on the currents like commuters stuck on rails, cephalopods were riding the equivalent of personal scooters. As they refined this system, their bodies changed. Shells grew lighter, then internalized, and eventually vanished in some lineages altogether. Losing the heavy external shell gave them unprecedented flexibility and speed, allowing for agile maneuvers that would have made any prehistoric predator jealous. With newfound mobility came curiosity, and with curiosity came a growing need for better sensory tools. This was the era when cephalopods began developing more sophisticated eyes, organs capable of sharp focus and complex processing. These eyes were not simple light detectors. They were intricate cameras that could distinguish shapes and movement with remarkable clarity. While many creatures in the ancient oceans relied on touch or chemical cues, cephalopods could literally see their world unfold. It was an evolutionary superpower, a tool that allowed them to navigate complex environments, watch for danger, and track prey with precision far beyond what most animals could manage at the time. But perhaps their most extraordinary leap was in the realm of intelligence. Cephalopods developed nervous systems far more elaborate than the typical marine animal of their era. Their brains expanded, neural circuits grew denser, and they began coordinating their movements with fluid, purposeful control. No one from those ancient times left a detailed diary, but fossils and modern cephalopods suggest that their ancestors were problem solvers long before the ocean produced anything with bones or built-in armor. This intelligence wasn't flashy or philosophical, it was practical. The early cephalopods needed to make rapid decisions: when to flee, when to strike, how to position themselves in shifting currents, where to hide if predators approached from above, and how to locate prey that moved unpredictably. These decisions required processing power, and evolution delivered, creating animals that could outmaneuver most of their contemporaries. As they grew more capable, cephalopods began expanding into deeper oceans. The shallows had plenty of competition and danger, and the deeper realms offered both safety and opportunities. Descending into dimmer waters gave them access to new food sources and fewer predators, but it also demanded fresh adaptations. Their eyes adjusted to low light. Their bodies grew sleeker. Their propulsion systems became more refined, allowing them to dart through the darker layers with uncanny control. Some of the earliest deep-diving cephalopods likely used their tentacles to probe the surroundings, tapping into vibrations or sensing chemical trails. Tentacles became multifunctional tools: anchors, grabbers, feelers, and sometimes even communicators. The more they used them, the more complex they became. branching into specialized satis shapes and strengths that allowed cephalopods to manipulate their environment in ways other animals simply couldn't. In the deep, cephalopods also discovered the value of stealth. Their soft bodies made little noise, and their movements disturbed the water minimally. This silence allowed them to slip through the depths like shadows, an advantage that later squids and octopuses would take to dazzling extremes. While early cephalopods lacked modern bioluminescence, they still used darkness as an ally, hiding from threats and ambushing prey with a strategic calm that bordered on artistry. These early pioneers didn't yet have the ink-spraying abilities of their modern descendants, nor the shape-shifting camouflage tricks that modern octopuses deploy with theatrical flair. But they laid the foundation. With their growing intelligence, flexible bodies, and increasingly refined movement, they set the stage for a lineage that would one day produce some of the ocean's cleverest, most adaptable creatures. The arrival of cephalopods was a turning point in marine evolution. They weren't the biggest, the strongest, or the most armored. But they had something better. The combination of mobility, sensory sophistication, and decision-making. In a world where many animals drifted or reacted slowly, cephalopods responded quickly, aimed precisely, and navigated their environment with surprising insight. Long before humans looked at modern octopuses and wondered whether they were secretly plotting something, their ancient ancestors were already rewriting the rules of ocean survival. They became explorers, hunters, strategists, and innovators, proof that intelligence, tentacles, and a good propulsion system can take you farther than armor ever will. By the time deep-sea sharks entered the evolutionary timeline, the ocean's upper layers had already become a battleground of speed, agility, and quick-thinking predators. But the depths, those cold, silent zones far below the reach of sunlight, played by an entirely different set of rules. Down there, every calorie counts. Movement is a luxury, and life asks you to slow down or be swallowed by the dark. Sharks, those icons of sleek predation in shallower waters, responded to this challenge not by ramping up their power, but by rethinking their entire operating strategy. And what emerged from this transformation were some of the most patient, enigmatic creatures on Earth. Deep-sea sharks, built for survival through endurance rather than force. Their journey into the abyss began millions of years ago, when some shark lineages gradually ventured beyond the continental shelves. At first, these excursions were probably brief, dips into dimmer waters in search of food or to escape competition above. But as ocean currents shifted, prey species moved, and environmental pressures changed. Certain sharks found opportunity in the depths, with fewer competitors, fewer predators, and a kind of stillness that coastal waters could never offer. The deep ocean became an open frontier. Evolution, ever observant, started tuning their bodies for these unfamiliar conditions. The first problem they faced was temperature. Deep-sea environments are cold, icy, bone-deep cold, that slows everything from digestion to muscle action. For sharks, whose bodies depend on external temperatures to regulate metabolic rates, this could have been a deal-breaker. But instead of resisting the cold, deep-sea sharks embraced it. Their metabolism slowed dramatically, reducing the energy they needed to survive. Movements became measured, almost meditative. A deep-sea shark can glide through the water like a drifting shadow, expending so little energy that a single meal might sustain it far longer than anyone would expect. This slow metabolism wasn't just a cost-saving strategy, it became a philosophy of existence. In a world with limited food, rushing around is a recipe for starvation. Instead, deep-sea sharks learned patience on a scale that borders on spiritual. Some species spend hours drifting along in gentle currents, scanning for scents or vibrations that hint at distant prey. Others sit, nearly motionless, waiting for an unfortunate fish or squid to wander close enough to grab. There are few places on Earth where waiting quietly can be more effective than chasing, and the deep sea is one of them. Of course, the darkness posed another challenge. Without sunlight, vision becomes a tricky sense to rely on, so deep-sea sharks refined their sensory toolkit. Their eyes enlarged, not for seeing colors or details, but for capturing the faintest traces of bioluminescent glows and silhouettes. Some species developed a reflective layer behind the retina, boosting their ability to detect minimal hints of light in the gloom. If shallow water sharks are visual hunters, deep-sea sharks are interpreters of shadows. But sight is only part of the story. These sharks also honed senses that had nothing to do with light. Their lateral lines became ultra-sensitive, detecting minute vibrations from great distances. They refined their ability to read chemical signals, picking up on the faintest scent trails drifting through the water. When a faraway creature shed skin cells or excreted waste, a deep-sea shark could detect the chemical footprint long before its quarry knew anyone was coming. They became masters of reading the water like an ancient scroll written in molecules. Some deep-sea sharks, like the famous Greenland shark, took slowness to an extreme rarely seen in vertebrates. With metabolism so unhurried that their hearts beat with the leisurely rhythm of a creature entirely unconcerned with time, Greenland sharks glide through icy depths at speeds that would make a snail feel confident. And yet, they survive centuries, literally centuries, outliving storms, predators, and even entire civilizations forming and fading on land. Their secret lies not in speed, but in profound biological moderation, the kind that makes them feel like monks, drifting through a cathedral of darkness. Other deep-sea species evolved different adaptations for the abyss. Some developed glowing patches on their undersides to camouflage themselves against faint light filtering down, a trick called counter-illumination. By matching the weak glow above them, they vanish from the sight of predators lurking below. This camouflage is delicate work, requiring just enough light to erase the silhouette without creating a spotlight effect. Imagine the precision of adjusting a lamp to exactly match the brightness of the room. It's a subtle art, and deep-sea sharks perform it instinctively. Their bodies also adapted to crushing pressure. At depths where water weighs down with immense force, bones and tissues risk collapse. Sharks solved this by leaning heavily on cartilage, flexible, durable, and excellent for enduring pressure swings. It's the same material that makes their shallower relatives so maneuverable. But in the deep sea, it becomes a structural advantage. Cartilage doesn't crack easily. It bends, flexes, and absorbs force, making these sharks surprisingly resilient to the heavy-handed environment they inhabit. Diet in the deep is unpredictable, so deep-sea sharks became opportunists. When they find food, they make it count. Some feed on sleeping fish, snatching meals too groggy to react. Others target carrion drifting from above, whale falls, fish remains, or anything that gravity delivers like a slow-motion gift. A few species employ ambush tactics, using dark waters as cover to launch sudden, precise attacks that seem almost unfair in their efficiency. Despite their adaptations, deep-sea sharks are not solitary oddities. They play essential roles in their ecosystems. They recycle nutrients, prune populations of deep ocean species, and maintain balance in environments where one misstep could cascade into collapse. In their quiet, deliberate way, they keep the abyss alive. In the end, deep-sea sharks are reminders that survival doesn't always belong to the fastest, brightest, or loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the patient, the steady, the ones who can glide through darkness without fear, trusting in senses sharpened over millions of years, and a metabolism content to move through life at a pace that would make a meditative retreat look rushed. Down in the dark, deep-sea sharks reign not through force, but through wisdom written into their very biology, ancient, measured, and utterly unbothered by the frantic world above. Long before anyone imagined exploring the deep ocean with submersibles, long before the idea of life without sunlight seemed anything but science fiction, the Earth itself was busy setting the stage for one of its strangest, boldest experiments. It happened far below the waves, in landscapes of darkness where pressure could crush steel and the cold seeped into every crevice like a permanent winter. Down there, where the sunlight of the surface might as well have been a myth, cracks in the seafloor began to seep heat. At first, the The warmth was subtle, whispers of energy rising from the planet's molten interior. But over time, these whispers became chimneys of scorching water, belching minerals, transforming the deep, and giving rise to ecosystems that followed none of the rules life had embraced until then. These structures, the hydrothermal vents, formed in places where tectonic plates pulled apart or ground against one another. As the seafloor stretched and cracked, seawater trickled down into the Earth's crust, where it met hot rock simmering just below the surface. The water superheated in an instant, absorbing metals and minerals along the way, then shot back upward through vent openings like an underwater geyser. When this mineral-rich water hit the frigid seawater, it solidified into towering chimneys, black smokers, white smokers, and everything in between, rising from the ocean floor like crooked stacks forged by a world that had decided to experiment with architecture. Nothing about these vents looked promising for life. The water around them can reach temperatures close to boiling, and the fluid they release is laced with chemicals that would be toxic to most surface organisms. Yet, astonishingly, life not only appeared here, it flourished. It was as if evolution took one look at this hostile environment and thought, challenge accepted. The key to this rebellion against sunlight was chemosynthesis, where organisms at the surface relied on photosynthesis, capturing sunlight to build energy-rich molecules. The vent communities relied on chemical reactions. Microbes near the vents used hydrogen sulfide, a compound that smells like rotten eggs and would make most animals flee in disgust, as a power source. They oxidized it, using the reaction to assemble the building blocks of life. These tiny chemototrophic microbes became the quiet engines driving entire ecosystems, proving that life didn't need the sun's approval after all. In this new world, chemical energy was king. Once the microbes carved out an energy niche, larger organisms followed. Tube worms, those long, elegant creatures with crimson plumes, became signature residents of the vents. They anchored themselves in the mineral structures, hosting internal bacteria that produced nutrients for them. The worms had no mouths, no stomachs, and no digestive systems in the traditional sense. They were living apartment complexes providing space for their bacterial tenants, who repaid them by manufacturing food. It was a partnership so intimate and efficient that tube worms grew to lengths that would make a garden hose jealous. Other creatures joined the community as well. Vent crabs scuttled around the chimneys, picking off morsels and occasionally challenging each other in slow-motion territorial disputes. Massive clams clustered in dense beds, gaping open to filter microbes drifting in the water. Even some species of shrimp evolved eyes modified for detecting the faint glow produced by the extreme heat of the vents. Not sunlight, not bioluminescence, but thermal radiation bleeding from the Earth itself. Predators too found their way into these alien realms. Some were blind fish adapted to the dark, sweeping near the vents like patient hunters patrolling a dim, sulfur-scented neighborhood. Others were specialized worms or snails with heat-resistant adaptations, navigating the lethal gradients between blistering vent fluid and icy seawater. The closer they got to the vents, the narrower the band of survivable temperature became, just centimeters between comfort and instant disaster. But the rewards were rich. Food was plentiful here compared to most of the deep sea. These ecosystems operated on a foundation utterly different from every surface ecosystem the planet had ever known. No sunlight trickled down from above. No plants or algae formed the first links in the food chain. Instead, Earth's inner heat, its molten heart, powered an entire community. It was a revelation not only for the organisms living there, but eventually for the humans who discovered them. When scientists first laid eyes on these bustling oases in 1977, they realized the implications stretch far beyond marine biology. If life could thrive here, in darkness and chemical fumes, where else could it exist? Hydrothermal vents didn't remain static either. They shifted, collapsed, and reformed. Entire communities would grow for decades or centuries around a vent, only for the flow of hot water to change or stop entirely. When that happened, the bustling neighborhood became a ghost town, and residents had to disperse or perish. Yet new vents, born in fresh cracks in the seafloor, gave life another chance. The dynamic cycle of destruction and renewal shaped the evolution of vent species, rewarding flexibility, endurance, and rapid colonization. The existence of these ecosystems underscored a profound truth. Life on Earth is more versatile than anyone had guessed. It can feed on sunlight, sure, but it can also feed on the Earth's chemistry, its heat, its minerals, and its restless geology. Life can root itself in darkness, thrive under pressure, and flourish in toxic waters that look like they belong in a planet's first draft, rather than its final version. Hydrothermal vents stand as quiet monuments to life's creativity. They remind us that biology is not limited to the familiar, that the rules we think define life are sometimes only suggestions. In their towers of mineral smoke, in the glow of Earth's own heat, life built a thriving community deep in the dark, proving once again that given the slightest opportunity, nature will always find a way. Far below the sunlit waves, deeper than the twilight zone, and well beyond the fiery glow of hydrothermal vents, lies one of the most misunderstood landscapes on Earth, the abyssal plains. Stretching across vast swaths of the seafloor like a dark, ancient quilt, these plains are often portrayed as barren wastelands, silent, empty, and void of life. But step onto this immense underwater desert, and you'll discover a world that thrives precisely because of its quiet isolation. These plains may be flat, cold, and dim as a forgotten cellar, but they are anything but lifeless. Life here simply plays by a different set of rules. The abyssal plains sit between 3 and 6 kilometers deep, where pressure is so intense it feels like the weight of several elephants politely insisting you stay put. Sunlight cannot travel this far. The faintest hint of day never reaches these depths. Temperatures hover just above freezing, currents drift like unhurried thoughts, and the seafloor stretches outward in every direction, smooth and unbroken except for the occasional ripple or ancient mound of sediment. It is a realm where speed is unnecessary, where patience is the ultimate survival skill, and where resources arrive not in abundance, but as a slow, steady trickle. That trickle is the key to the entire abyssal ecosystem, nutrient rain. Everything that lives in the deep depends on the downward drift of organic debris from the ocean above. Tiny particles of dead plankton, discarded scales, marine snow, and the occasional larger feast, like a fallen squid or fish, drift gently from higher waters. It's not a rainstorm, more like a perpetual drift of cosmic dust, except the cosmos in this case is the bustling ocean overhead. Every speck is a gift. And abyssal organisms treat each morsel with deep gratitude, in the kind of slow-motion banquet that can stretch across centuries. Because food is sparse and unpredictable, abyssal creatures have evolved strategies that make minimalism look like an extreme sport. One of the most iconic residents here is the sea cucumber. At first glance, a sea cucumber looks like a wandering slipper that decided movement was optional. But its slow pace isn't laziness, it's efficiency. Sea cucumbers roam the plains like gentle vacuum cleaners, scooping up sediments and harvesting whatever nutrients cling to them. They do this tirelessly, processing the seafloor grain by grain in a living cycle of recycling that keeps the ecosystem functioning. Then there are the brittle stars, those delicate relatives of starfish that look like animated constellation sketches. They spread their slender arms across the sediment like living antennae, waiting for the slightest vibration or drifting particle. A single touch of organic matter is enough to set them moving, quickly compared to their neighbors, curling food into their mouths with surprising coordination. Brittle stars can gather in massive communities, carpeting the abyss like spindly forests, waiting for the next nutrient shower. Other organisms take a different path entirely. Some abyssal fish, like the famous abyssal grenadiers, survive by embracing extreme patience. They drift above the plains with slow, deliberate flicks of their tails, conserving energy as though each movement requires boardroom-level approval. Their bodies are long, tapered, and often pale, with large eyes that seem less interested in seeing and more focused on interpreting the faintest glimmer of bioluminescence drifting by. In the abyss, eyesight is a suggestion, not a guarantee. But not all life slinks along the seafloor. Some species anchor themselves into the sediment and let the deep currents deliver nutrients directly. One of the most mysterious examples is the xenophyophore, a single-celled organism so massive for its type that it challenges our definition of cell entirely. These creatures form elaborate shell-like structures from sediment particles, creating miniature mansions for themselves. They thrive in conditions that would send most cells into immediate panic, calmly filtering food from the currents like slow-motion architects whose building projects span decades. Predators exist here too, but their hunting strategies are sculpted by scarcity. Some snails have evolved long siphons to detect chemical cues from distant prey. Certain deep-sea worms launch ambushes from burrows, erupting upward like jack-in-the-boxes armed with bristles. And then there are the enigmatic deep-sea octopuses, who glide across the plain with gentle pulses, almost ghost-like, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet of the abyss. One of the most remarkable adaptations in this realm is longevity. Many abyssal species grow slowly, reproduce infrequently, and live extraordinarily long lives. It's not unusual for some corals or sponges on abyssal plains to be centuries or even millennia old. These are organisms that learned early that rushing is unnecessary when your environment moves at the pace of drifting dust. Their entire existence is an ode to patience. Even the landscape, though appearing flat and monotonous, tells stories for those who know how to read them. Tracks from sea stars create delicate streaks in the sediment. Small mounds hint at burrowing creatures beneath. Scattered bones mark places where larger meals once arrived from above. A fallen whale, perhaps, or a fish that drifted past its prime. These so-called whale falls create miniature ecosystems that can thrive for decades, drawing in scavengers from miles around and creating temporary islands of abundance in an otherwise lean world. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the abyssal plains is their quiet productivity. Though each creature moves slowly and food arrives in microscopic increments, the combined activity of millions of organisms reshapes the seafloor, circulates nutrients, and stabilizes sediments. It is a living machine, steady and understated, but absolutely essential to the health of the global ocean. The abyssal plains are dark, cold, and vast, but never empty. They are a testament to life's ability to persist, adapt, and quietly flourish in places where survival seems improbable. In this still world of drifting nutrients and patient creatures, life whispers rather than roars. But the message is unmistakable. Even in the deepest darkness, nature finds a way to thrive. If there's one thing the deep ocean loves more than pitch-black darkness and unsettling silence, it's breaking the rules. Depth seems to warp biology the way a funhouse mirror warps reflections. Some creatures stretch to epic proportions, while others shrink down into miniature versions of themselves. Down here, size makes about as much sense as a fish riding a bicycle. And yet, every odd trend has a reason. The deep sea is a world where colossal squids lurk like drifting legends. Oversized amphipods scuttle around like armored raisins on steroids, and tiny sniper-like sharks grow no bigger than a human palm. It's evolution's studio for rewriting the size charts with a flair for drama. To understand why giants roam the deep, picture the conditions down there. It's cold, permanently cold, like the ocean is running its air conditioner year-round and refusing to adjust the thermostat. Cold temperatures slow metabolisms, and slow metabolisms can support much larger bodies. Being big becomes an advantage. Large bodies store energy better, maintain stable internal conditions, and navigate the dark more efficiently. If you're a deep-sea giant, you don't need to sprint. You just need to keep drifting along, quietly, confidently, like someone who knows they're unbotherable. No creature embodies this deep-sea gigantism better than the colossal squid. These legendary animals, larger cousins of the giant squid, appear built on a scale usually reserved for mythological sea monsters. They have eyes the size of dinner plates, tentacles tipped with swiveling hooks, and muscular mantles that can stretch several meters. Their size isn't a quirk, it's the evolutionary solution to living in an environment where prey is scarce. Predators are rare, and stealth is everything. A big body allows them to store more energy, survive long fasting periods, and generate enough force to capture fast-moving prey like deep-living fish and toothy predators, such as the Antarctic toothfish. But colossal squids aren't alone in embracing supersizing. Amphipods, those tiny crustaceans that scurry under rocks in tide pools, also explode in size at great depths. Some deep-sea species grow as large as human hands. Imagine picking up a pebble during a beach walk and discovering a shrimp-like creature the size of a paperback novel staring back at you. Deep-sea amphipods owe their size partly to the absence of crushing predation and partly to the physics of cold water, which allows oxygen to diffuse more efficiently into their bodies. With plenty of oxygen and fewer things trying to eat them, they can afford to be bold about growth. Even worms join the giant club. Deep-sea polychaetes, segmented worms, usually about the size of pencils in shallow waters, can reach lengths that would require a dedicated storage system if you tried to bring one home. Their elongated bodies help them navigate soft sediments while maximizing surface area for oxygen absorption. In a world where every calorie matters, efficiency becomes an art form. But if gigantism is one side of the deep-sea coin, miniaturization is the other. Some species shrink down to almost comical proportions. The lantern sharks of the deep are a perfect example. Members of this family include some of the smallest sharks on Earth. Imagine a shark so tiny it could swim through a large coffee mug, an adorable miniature version of its fearsome relatives. These sharks glow faintly, helping them vanish into the darkness, and their small size means they require very little energy to survive. In an ecosystem where food is unpredictable, staying tiny is a wise strategy. Deep-sea dwarf species also include isopods, snails, and certain crustaceans that look like miniaturized models of their shallower cousins. In these cases, shrinking reduces energy demands to manageable levels. Small bodies require less oxygen, less food, and less movement, ideal for a place where life must navigate scarcity with care. It's the biological equivalent of switching to a compact car when gasoline becomes too expensive, but perhaps the most charmingly strange examples are species that mix gigantism and dwarfism in unexpected ways. Take the deep-sea anglerfish. Females can reach sizes large enough to swallow prey nearly as big as themselves, while the males are tiny, so tiny in fact that they fuse permanently onto the bodies of females like evolutionary hitchhikers. In the darkness, where finding a mate is statistically harder than winning a cosmic lottery, shrinking down and becoming a lifelong passenger is surprisingly effective. What drives the deep sea's size contradictions is not chaos, but context. Pressure rises with depth, oxygen availability shifts, temperatures plummet, and food becomes increasingly scarce. These factors favor extremes, being very large to survive long stretches without meals, or being very small to conserve energy. The middle-of-the-road approach doesn't fare as well here. In the deep ocean, moderation rarely wins. There's also the matter of predators, or rather, the lack of them. Gigantic animals can thrive in deep waters because there are fewer giant predators capable of taking them down. Meanwhile, tiny species survive by avoiding attention altogether. It's a world where bold extremes are safer than blending in. Beyond biology, the deep-sea giants and dwarfs challenge our imaginations. They remind us that our familiar size expectations come from a world shaped by sunlight, warmth, and abundant resources. Remove those factors, and evolution begins sculpting creatures according to different physics, different economics, and different survival philosophies. Here, being the size of a school bus or the size of a spoon is equally sensible. depending on your ecological niche. In the end, the rise of giants and dwarfs in the deep sea paints a picture of life that thrives not by following rules, but by rewriting them. Down in the abyss, there is no normal. There is no average. There are only creatures sculpted by darkness, pressure, and opportunity. Creatures that grow enormous, shrink tiny, or settle somewhere creatively in between. The deep sea doesn't care about balance. It cares about survival. And in that pursuit, size becomes a flexible, playful variable, a reminder that in the ocean's greatest depths, evolution's imagination is as vast as the darkness itself. Today's deep ocean feels like a world suspended in time, as if the clocks down there run on geological settings rather than biological ones. The creatures that inhabit these vast, silent waters live at a pace so slow and deliberate, it can make a tortoise look like a sprinter with ambition. For millions of years, they've refined their survival strategies in an environment where change unfolds at the speed of drifting sediment. And because the deep sea evolved under such steady, predictable conditions, its residents developed astonishing adaptations, but also a dangerous dependency on stability. The deep ocean thrives in calm, but that calm comes with a cost: fragility. Imagine descending past the last reach of sunlight, slipping through the twilight zone until even faint blue disappears. Below this point is the modern deep ocean, a realm defined by constancy. The temperature hovers just above freezing year-round. Light is non-existent. Currents flow like slow-moving rivers of thought. The pressure is immense, as if the ocean itself were pressing down with ancient patience. Down here, nothing happens quickly, and that slow pace shapes everything alive in it. Deep-sea animals grow slowly, mature slowly, and reproduce on timelines that would test the patience of any surface-dwelling creature. Some deep-sea corals grow only millimeters per year, yet reach ages measured in centuries. Many fish species live for decades, sometimes longer, gliding through the water like drifting shadows, unaware that their age could be written in tree ring-style patterns on their ear bones. When you spend your life in a near motionless world, haste becomes unnecessary. Longevity becomes the default. This slow pace isn't just a quirk, it's an adaptation to scarcity. Food in the deep ocean arrives sporadically, in pulses rather than predictable streams. Most of it comes from far above. Dead plankton, discarded scales, tiny particles, the leftovers of surface life that drift downward like snow. Larger meals, such as a fallen whale, are monumental events. The deep-sea equivalent of a banquet that draws in scavengers from miles around. Because resources appear so infrequently, deep-sea species evolved metabolisms designed for thrift. They move carefully, minimizing energy use, surviving on the biological equivalent of a tight budget that rarely gets a raise. This resource economy shapes not only their bodies, but their behaviors. Some fish hover motionless in the water column, waiting for passing prey rather than hunting it. Others bury themselves in mud, conserving energy until something edible ventures too close. Even predators here take calculated approaches, striking only when absolutely necessary. The deep ocean rewards patience, and everything about its inhabitants reflects that lesson. But what makes the deep sea extraordinary also makes it vulnerable. Slow growth and slow reproduction mean that many species lack the ability to recover quickly from disturbance. A population that takes a century to rebuild cannot bounce back from sudden harm the way fast-living surface species can. This vulnerability extends across ecosystems. Deep-sea coral gardens, for all their quiet beauty, are built on the fragile scaffolding of centuries-old colonies. A single damaged reef may take hundreds of years to recover, if it recovers at all. Exploration has revealed that these ecosystems are more interconnected than they appear. One patch of deep-sea sponge habitat supports specific invertebrates. Those invertebrates support fish. Those fish recycle nutrients back into the system. Remove one piece, and the chain slowly unravels. The deep is far from empty. It is bustling with relationships so delicate that they often go unnoticed until they're disrupted. In recent decades, the deep ocean has faced pressures it never evolved to withstand. Deep-sea trawling, dragging heavy nets across the seafloor, can flatten centuries-old coral structures in minutes. Mining for minerals threatens to disturb sediment layers that have remained undisturbed since long before human civilizations existed. Even noise from ships can travel deep into the water column, disrupting species that rely on faint vibrations for communication or navigation. Pollution also finds its way into the deep. Microplastics, drifting like unwelcome confetti, sink slowly until they accumulate in the stomachs of deep-sea creatures that evolved in a world where particles always meant food. Chemical pollutants settle on the seafloor, infiltrating organisms that have no defense against substances their ancestors never encountered. Even climate change affects this realm indirectly, altering the frequency and quality of nutrient rain from above. Despite these threats, deep-sea ecosystems are not passive victims. They're resilient within the slow constraints of their environment. Some species shift their ranges in response to changes in temperature or oxygen. Others adapt subtly, tweaking their feeding habits or movement patterns. But their resilience has limits. Evolution has prepared them for stability, not upheaval, and modern disturbances often arrive too quickly for adaptation to keep pace. Still, the deep ocean continues to be a sanctuary of extraordinary life. Even today, new species are discovered regularly. Translucent fish that seem carved from moonlight, delicate worms that glimmer like drifting filaments, and ancient corals stretching across the seafloor like alien forests. These discoveries remind us that the deep remains largely unexplored, its mysteries far from exhausted. What makes the modern deep ocean so remarkable is this combination of endurance and vulnerability. It is a kingdom built on slow rhythms, where creatures have mastered the art of surviving with almost no resources. But it is also a kingdom not designed for sudden change. A single misstep from the surface world can echo downward for centuries. The deep ocean stands today as a testament to life's ability to flourish in even the most challenging environments, patiently, quietly, and beautifully. But its future depends on whether we allow it to continue thriving at its own pace. In a world that often rushes, the deep sea offers a powerful reminder that some of Earth's most extraordinary ecosystems live slowly, grow slowly, and break easily. And once broken, they may take longer than human history to heal. If you trace the story of ocean life from its very beginning, from those first shimmering shallows where chemistry stumbled into biology, all the way down to the black, whispering depths that cradle Earth's oldest secrets, you follow a narrative more sweeping than any epic humans have ever written. It is a saga of reinvention, of possibility, of stubborn persistence. Life did not simply appear and expand. It adapted, transformed, collapsed, and rebuilt, sculpting new forms, as if evolution itself were a restless artist, never satisfied with a single design. Looking back across billions of years, the ocean appears not as one world, but as many layered worlds, each reshaped by the creatures that dared to inhabit it. At the start, life clung to sunlight, gathering in the warm, shallow pools where energy rained from above like a gift. But soon, those earliest pioneers reshaped the very chemistry of the Earth, preparing the stage for complexity. From simple cells came structured cells. From structured cells came cooperative clusters. And from those clusters emerged bodies, soft sculptures drifting, settling, or pulsing through waters that had never before seen movement more coordinated than a swirl of particles. Then came the great leap of innovation during the Cambrian, when the sea floor became a runway for new designs. Eyes, armor, limbs, and jaws appeared like sudden plot twists no one saw coming. Predators sharpened their strategies, prey honed their defenses, and ecosystems bloomed with interactions that pushed life forward. After eons of timid experimentation, evolution decided to get bold, proving once and for all that creativity is not confined to artists. it also belongs to the genes quietly testing new possibilities. As the ages rolled on, life pressed outward and downward. It ventured into twilight waters where sunlight faded, then farther still into deep zones where darkness reigned. There, new rules took over. Some creatures ditched solidity for translucence. Others learned to glow. Predators became quiet stalkers of shadow. Entire communities drifted and pulsed in mid-water realms where survival depended not on strength, but on delicate balance. The deep became evolution's workshop for the strange, the ethereal, and the unexpectedly beautiful. Still deeper, near volcanic scars on the seafloor, life discovered something astonishing. Energy not carried from the sky, but born from the earth itself. Hydrothermal vents erupted with heat and minerals, and microbes seized the opportunity with determined flair. They built ecosystems where sunlight meant nothing, towering tube worms, nimble crustaceans, and heat-loving creatures formed a world powered by chemistry, a reminder that life rarely turns down a good challenge. Beyond those fiery oases lay the abyssal plains, stretching outward in quiet immensity. There, the living moved slowly, harvesting falling particles with care. The deep ocean's patience became a kind of shared rhythm, spoken not through sound, but through measured drifting, deliberate feeding, and quiet endurance. And even here, where energy meanders rather than rushes, evolution found room for spectacle. Giants rising from soft mud, dwarfs shrinking for efficiency, and organisms refining survival strategies to a minimalist art. As time progressed, sharks, squids, and countless others adapted to the deep's demands. Some grew ancient and wise in their slowness, others embraced speed in darkness. Still others transformed their bodies into improbable shapes that barely resemble anything from their surface counterparts. The modern deep ocean stands today as a living archive of evolutionary imagination, a slow-moving symphony conducted in pressure and cold. And yet, no matter how far life descended, the ocean never stopped reinventing itself. From chaos came order, from order came diversity, and from diversity came systems so complex that even today we have explored only the surface of understanding them. For every creature we discover, dozens more remain hidden, slipping through uncharted canyons, drifting in silent currents, or clinging to rocks beneath crushing weight. The ocean keeps its secrets well, not out of malice, but out of scale. There is simply too much of it, too deep, too wide, too old, for any single lifetime to map its full story. This long journey, from sunlit beginnings to the abyss's stillness, is a testament to life's reach. It shows that biology is not bound by circumstance. Life does not ask permission from the world around it. It adapts until the world makes room. Whether bathed in warmth or swallowed by darkness, whether perched on a shallow reef or drifting above an endless plain, life finds a foothold, then stretches that foothold into an ecosystem. Reflecting on this story, it becomes clear that the ocean is not merely a habitat. It is a chronicle, storing chapters written in shells, bones, genes, and adaptations. It remembers everything that has ever occurred within it, the first spark of biochemistry, the rise of predators, the silence of extinction events, the elegant persistence of deep-sea creatures that move like whispers through the dark. And perhaps most thrilling of all is the understanding that the story is not finished. Even now, evolution continues its quiet work. In unseen trenches, new species form. In drifting currents, adaptations take root. In vent fields, microbes test the limits of metabolism. We stand on the shore, looking out at a surface that hides countless lives, countless surprises, and countless answers to questions we have not yet learned to ask. So as we close this journey from shallow seas to the abyss, one truth stands out. The ocean still holds chapters unwritten, mysteries unopened, and wonders waiting patiently in the dark. Life's greatest experiments are not behind us. They are unfolding right now, beneath the waves, far out of sight, but never out of reach for those curious enough to keep exploring.